The gate was rusted at the hinges, its paint peeled into flakes that the wind carried across the gravel. Beyond it, silence. And beside that silence, a German shepherd sat like a statue, ribs faintly showing beneath his thick fur, amber eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. He did not move when the crows passed overhead. He did not stir when strangers approached and left scraps of food. He only shifted slightly, lifting his head whenever a car slowed, as if each engine might carry the one voice he knew. Weeks had passed this way. Rain had soaked him until his fur clung to his body like a weighted cloak. Frost had numbed his paws in the dawn light. The world around him moved. Children went to school, neighbors carried groceries, yet he stayed. Waiting, guarding, believing that the gate would one day swing open and reveal the figure he longed for. And then, one morning, just as the sun broke the horizon and lit the iron bars in gold, something finally changed. The mornings came quietly, painted in pale blue light and the mist of early dew. Gravel crunched faintly beneath the footsteps of those who passed by, their eyes always drifting toward the gate at the end of the lane. It stood there like an old sentinel, its once green paint cracked into scales, its iron bars streaked with rust. And beside it, always beside it, sat the German shepherd. He did not bark. He did not pace. He simply sat, regal yet worn, as if the earth itself had grown him into that place. His fur, once rich and glossy, now carried the stains of weeks in the weather. Rain had left it heavy with a dull sheen. Dust clung in patches where he lay pressed against the dirt, and the frost of dawn turned the tips of his coat into shards of silver. When the wind curled around the gate, carrying the scent of bread from the bakery down the street, or the diesel tang of buses roaring by, his nose twitched but his body did not move. His gaze remained fixed on the road beyond. The neighbors had grown used to him, though none could ignore the sight. Some whispered about his devotion, calling it beautiful, like something out of an old fable. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was tragic, almost unbearable to watch. A few tried to lure him away, coaxing him with slices of meat or gentle words, but he refused them all. His eyes never softened, his body never followed. They realized slowly that his loyalty was not a thing that could be broken by kindness. It was carved too deeply into him. Children on their way to school slowed their steps, their laughter quieting as they drew near. They carried the innocence of believing that all stories end well, and so some crouched by the fence, calling softly, "Come on, boy." But the shepherd would only glance once, then lower his head back to the gravel. To them, it seemed he was waiting for something only he could see. At night, when the world grew quiet and the street lamps flickered with moths, he curled against the gate. The metal chilled his back, but he pressed close, as if trying to seep through to whatever world lay on the other side. Cars hummed by, their headlights flashing across his eyes, yet he did not stir. The darkness was not empty for him. It was alive with memory, footsteps on the gravel, the creak of the hinges, a voice calling his name. That voice had vanished, swallowed by silence, and still he listened for it every night. There were moments, fleeting and cruel, when hope surged too sharply. A car would slow near the corner, the engine grumbling into a low idle. His head would snap up, ears standing tall, eyes blazing, his muscles tensed, and for a breathless instant it looked as though he would leap. But then the car rolled on, leaving exhaust in its wake, and the light in his eyes dimmed again. Each time it happened, it etched deeper lines of waiting into his frame. Rain was the hardest. It came in long, relentless sheets, soaking the ground into mud and drumming on the tin roof of a nearby shed. The shepherd would sit through it, head bowed but unyielding. Water streamed off his muzzle, his paws sinking into the sludge, his chest heaving with the cold. Neighbors watched from their windows, torn between pity and awe, but he never sought shelter. To him, leaving the gate even for a moment was unthinkable. It was the one place where memory still touched the present. As days bled into weeks, he grew thinner. His ribs pressed faintly against his sides. Those scraps of food left by kind hands kept him alive. Hunger gnawed at him, but devotion fed him more deeply than meat. The road ahead remained empty, the hinges unmoved. Yet every dawn he lifted his head when the first light broke, amber eyes glowing in the pale fire of morning, as if today, perhaps today, the silence would finally break. And so the gate remained closed, the shepherd waiting, the world moving around him. His vigil became a story whispered through the town, a question that carried in hushed voices. Who could inspire such devotion? And why had they not returned? What no one could know, as the coldest night yet fell upon him and the stars wheeled overhead, was that the waiting was only the beginning, that beneath the silence, something was already shifting, unseen but inevitable. The days had stacked into one another like weathered stones, indistinguishable except for the weight they left on his body. Yet somewhere deep inside the German shepherd, memory pulsed brighter than hunger, stronger than cold. When the wind shifted, carrying faint scents of earth and grass, it cracked open the chambers of his mind and filled him with images so vivid they were almost unbearable. He remembered the sound of footsteps, boots crunching on gravel, steady and familiar. He remembered the whistle, low and warm, that always preceded the call of his name. In the echo of silence, the memory returned whole the way his ears perked. His heart surged, and he bounded toward the man who belonged to him. That man's hand was rough with work yet gentle in its touch, brushing behind his ears, resting against his chest. The shepherd could still feel the warmth of that palm as though it lingered in his fur. There had been fields once, long stretches of grass that caught the light like fire, the shepherd racing through them with his tongue lolling, his body alive with joy. The man would run too, clumsy and slow by comparison, but laughing, the sound spilling into the air like music. They would collapse together in the dirt, the shepherd's body pressing against him, both of them heaving with shared breath. Evening would settle soft and golden, and the shepherd would rest his head on the man's knee, eyelids heavy with the comfort of belonging. Those were the days when the world was simple food in the bowl, water in the tin, and the voice calling him home at dusk. Always, there had been a return. No matter how far he wandered through the fields or along the creek, when the sun dipped low, he would find the man waiting by that same gate, one hand on the bars, whistling softly. That gate had always opened, always, until the day it did not. Now, as he pressed his body against the cold iron, he relived that final morning with searing clarity. The man had left in a rush, voice hurried, eyes shadowed with something the shepherd could not understand. The gate had clanged shut behind him, and his boots had faded down the road. The shepherd had waited, certain that the day would close as all days did, with return, with touch, with home restored. But dusk had blurred into night, and no footsteps came. The neighbors pieced together fragments. Some said the man had fallen ill and been taken away. Others whispered of work that called him far from town, promises of return broken by distance. No one knew for certain, and no one told the shepherd. All he understood was absence. All he believed was that waiting would summon him back, even as the town tried to intervene. His tether to memory held stronger than their coaxing. A woman with kind eyes set down bowls of broth, speaking gently in a voice not unlike his man's. The shepherd ate, but when she tried to slip a leash around his neck, he backed away, hackles bristling, eyes pleading without words, "I cannot leave." What if he comes? A boy tried another day, holding out a ball, the same kind the man once threw into the fields. The shepherd looked at it, ears twitching, heart stirring with a pang of longing. But when the boy tossed it down the lane, the shepherd did not chase. His gaze remained locked on the gate, the ball lying abandoned in the dust. Memory was not only sound and touch but scent, and even the smallest whiff could undo him. One afternoon, a breeze carried the faint musk of motor oil and tobacco, the smells of the man's jacket. The shepherd leapt to his feet, heart pounding, eyes blazing with recognition. For a wild moment, he was certain the man was near, that the gate would swing wide. But the wind shifted, carrying the truth away, leaving him trembling with the ache of false hope. Night deepened his torment. In the stillness, he dreamed. His paws twitched as if running, his body jerking with phantom chases, his breath sharp with joy that vanished when his eyes opened to darkness. Sometimes he woke with a soft whimper, lifting his head to the gate, certain he had heard his name whispered through the rust. But it was only the wind again, playing tricks with what he longed for most. The town began to see not only his devotion but his suffering. They spoke in hushed tones about the cruelty of love that waits without answer. Yet even in their pity, They could not deny that there was something holy in it, a kind of faith that human hearts often lose too quickly. The shepherd did not know despair in the way people did. For him, waiting was not hopelessness but a covenant. He will come. He must. As autumn deepened, leaves skittered across the road, brittle and dry. The shepherd lay among them, chest rising slow, eyes half, lidded but still fixed on the horizon. Memory had become both balm and wound, keeping him alive while slicing him open daily. In each flicker of recall, the whistle, the laugh, the hand at his chest, he found reason to endure. And yet with every dawn that rose on emptiness, the echo of that voice grew fainter, leaving silence heavier than before. Still he remained. He had no language for giving up. The gate was his altar, and memory was his prayer. And though the world around him began to doubt, though even the most faithful neighbor whispered that perhaps he waited in vain, the shepherd's heart refused to yield. Because somewhere beyond the silence, beyond the weeks and the hunger and the rain, the echo of a voice still called his name. It was on one of those brittle mornings, when frost still clung to the edges of leaves and the world seemed locked in silence, that the stranger first appeared. The shepherd noticed him at once, though his instincts flared with suspicion rather than hope. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat, his boots scuffing the gravel as though he wasn't in any hurry. Unlike the others, he didn't carry scraps of food in his hands or whistle like someone calling to a lost dog. He simply stopped a few paces from the gate, crouched down, and watched. The shepherd's body stiffened, muscles tightening like coiled rope. His ears flicked forward, his eyes narrowed. He had endured many attempts, voices calling, hands reaching, gestures meant to lure him away. Each time he resisted. Loyalty was a weight on his chest, an anchor holding him to the gate. And yet this man did not try. He did not coax or advance. He simply sat in the cold morning air, the vapor of his breath rising in small clouds, as though he had nowhere else to be. Hours passed. The street grew busy, children rushing to school, neighbors lugging bags of groceries. The shepherd's gaze stayed trained on the road, but he felt the stranger's presence like a shadow at his side. When evening fell and the lamps blinked to life, the man rose, brushed dirt from his coat, and left without a word. The next day he returned. Again he crouched near the gate, quiet and patient. This time he set down a small dish of water, its surface trembling as he placed it gently on the ground. He did not slide it toward the shepherd or urge him closer. He only left it there, within reach if thirst won out, and folded his hands across his knees. The shepherd eyed it warily, his body taut with hesitation. But hours of stillness, the dryness in his throat, and the absence of any push finally overcame him. Cautiously, step by step, he edged forward, lowering his muzzle to lap once, twice, before retreating. The stranger did not move. Day after day, the ritual repeated. The man's presence became steady as the morning frost, his silence as constant as the shepherd's watch. He spoke occasionally, his voice low and calm, not demanding but offering. Simple words, "Good boy," or "You're safe," carried no urgency. They washed over the shepherd like ripples of warmth against the cold wall of his vigilance. The town began to notice. Neighbors whispered about the stranger, wondering why he came, who he was. Some muttered that he was wasting his time. Others, softer, hearted, hoped he might succeed where no one else could. But the shepherd did not belong to anyone except the man he waited for. That truth beat in his chest with every breath. And yet, there was something in the stranger's patience that stirred an ache he didn't understand. On the 7th morning, the shepherd dared a step closer. The man had placed food again, a small portion of cooked chicken fragrant in the cold air. Hunger gnawed at the shepherd's belly, but still he held back. The man did not reach out, did not try to seize him. Instead, he broke the food into smaller pieces and left them scattered like breadcrumbs, retreating a few steps to give space. The shepherd hesitated, ears flicking, then lowered his head to snatch the first piece, retreating quickly with it clenched between his teeth. Again the man stayed still, his eyes calm, as if the shepherd's trust was not something to be stolen but something to be earned slowly, like the warming of frozen ground under sun. By the 12th day, the shepherd had come close enough to feel the faint warmth of the man's hand resting lightly against the earth. He sniffed, nostrils flaring, taking in the scent. Human, but not the one he longed for. That realization made his body tense, ready to recoil. But the man did not push. He only kept his hand there, palm open, as if offering a promise rather than a command. For a long while, the shepherd stood trembling, torn between memory and need. Finally, he lowered his head, just enough that his nose brushed the stranger's fingers. A spark, fragile and fleeting, passed between them. It was not love, not yet. Love, for the shepherd, was a voice, a laugh, a gate swinging open at dusk. But it was something, a recognition that not all hands reached to take, that some reached simply to be near. That night, for the first time in weeks, the shepherd's sleep was less restless. He dreamed not of endless waiting but of running again, his paws pounding earth, his chest alive with breath. And though he still woke to the silence of the gate, there was a faint warmth lingering in him, like the echo of a fire not yet seen but felt in the bones. The stranger continued to return, rain or shine, each day settling in the dirt with quiet persistence. The shepherd began to anticipate him, ears twitching at the sound of boots on gravel. He still held to his vigil, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But sometimes, just sometimes, his eyes flicked sideways, checking that the man was there, that he had not vanished like the one he truly waited for. In those moments, the shepherd's heart split in two. One half clung to memory, fierce and unyielding. The other leaned, ever so slightly, toward the present hand held out in patience. It was a fragile balance, as if he stood on a narrow bridge suspended between what was lost and what might still be found. And though the gate remained closed, though the silence stretched on, a quiet shift had begun. For the first time, the shepherd was no longer entirely alone in his vigil. A stranger had taken a place beside him, not to break his loyalty but to share in it. And that, though small, was the beginning of change. The sky that morning broke differently. For weeks, the dawn had crept in with muted gray, a reluctant wash of light that barely pierced the frost. But now, as the first rays touched the cracked paint of the gate, there was a glow, soft gold bleeding into the horizon, as if the world itself was preparing for something. The shepherd stirred in his usual place, body stiff from the night's cold, dew soaking his fur. He shook once, droplets scattering like diamonds in the light, and resumed his post. His eyes, dulled from endless waiting, still lifted to the road as they had every morning before. The stranger was already there. He had come quietly, his boots crunching the gravel in steady rhythm, carrying with him nothing but his presence. He crouched by the gate, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air, and looked at the shepherd with the calm familiarity of one who no longer expected to be noticed but still came anyway. He had settled into this rhythm too, a kind of shared silence between them, where patience met devotion. But then, faint at first, almost drowned by the rustle of leaves, came a sound. A voice carried on the wind, a man's voice. The shepherd's ears snapped up, every muscle jolting awake as though struck by lightning. His eyes widened, pupils burning with recognition, his chest quivering. He rose, legs trembling, and turned toward the road. The stranger, startled, followed his gaze, footsteps. Slow, uneven, yet unmistakable. The shepherd's heart surged against his ribs, pounding with such force he could scarcely breathe. He took a step forward, then another, claws scraping against the gravel. The air shifted, and with it came the scent, familiar, aching, undeniable, the scent of home. And then the voice again, clearer now, raw with emotion. Boy, oh God, boy, it was him. The shepherd's body erupted into motion, his stillness shattered. He leapt at the gate, paws clanging against the iron bars, a bark bursting from his throat, deep, guttural, desperate, filled with weeks of silence breaking all at once. His tail whipped furiously, his entire frame quaking with the force of his joy. Beyond the gate, the figure appeared. Gaunt, face hollowed by time and hardship, but those eyes, those hands, that voice, it was the man he had waited for, his human. Tears streaked the man's face as he stumbled forward, clutching the bars, pressing his forehead against them. "I'm here, I'm so sorry, I came back." His voice cracked under the weight of grief and relief. The shepherd pressed against the gate, whining now, the sound high and broken, as if trying to pour his very soul through the bars. He licked desperately at the man's fingers as they reached through the rusted gaps, his body trembling with every touch. Weeks of hunger, nights of cold, days of emptiness, all of it collapsed in that one instant, undone by the return of the only person who had ever meant everything. The stranger stepped back, eyes wide, his throat tightening as he witnessed what no coaxing, no patience, no kindness could have replaced. He understood in that moment that his role had never been to take the shepherd away, but to wait alongside him until this very day arrived. The man fumbled with the latch, hands shaking so violently he could barely lift it. The metal groaned, stiff with rust, resisting the urgency of reunion. Come on," he muttered through sobs, his breath ragged. Finally, with a wrench and a cry, the gate swung inward. The shepherd exploded forward, not running away, not bounding into the road, but straight into the man's arms. He collided with him, knocking him to his knees in the dust, his weight pressing into the man's chest as his tongue covered every inch of his face. The man clung to him, fingers buried in fur, sobbing into his neck, his words tumbling out between gasps. "I never wanted to leave, I couldn't come back, but you, God, you waited for me." Their cries mingled, the man's broken apologies, the shepherd's howls of joy, until the world around them blurred. Neighbors emerged from their doorways, drawn by the sound, their hands covering their mouths as they watched the miracle unfold. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads as though witnessing something sacred. The stranger, standing a few paces away, closed his eyes against the sting of tears, his heart both breaking and mending in the same breath. The shepherd would not let go. His paws pressed into the man's shoulders, his muzzle buried against the familiar chest that smelled of oil and tobacco, the scent he had dreamed of for endless nights. His tail thudded against the ground with relentless force, as if to beat back every second of the silence that had stretched too long. Time seemed suspended, held in the golden light of morning. The shepherd's loyalty had endured storms, hunger, and loneliness. It had withstood the weight of absence. And now it was rewarded in the purest way. A return, an embrace, a reunion that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. When at last the man rose, unsteady on his feet, the shepherd pressed close against his side, unwilling to allow even an inch of space between them. The stranger stepped forward then, hesitant, unsure if he belonged in this sacred circle. But the man reached out with a trembling hand, gripping the stranger's arm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "You stayed with him. You didn't let him give up." The stranger only shook his head, unable to speak, for he knew the truth. It was never his patience that had kept the shepherd alive. It was love, unyielding, unbroken, carved deeper than time. And so, as the sun climbed higher, painting the street in warmth, the man and the shepherd walked together through the once closed gate. It swung wide behind them, no longer a barrier of rust and silence, but an open passage into a future reclaimed. The gate that had once stood as a wall between silence and hope now hung open, its hinges loose, its rust catching the sunlight like copper flames. The shepherd walked through it pressed against his human side, as though the distance of weeks had collapsed into this single step. The world beyond the gate seemed transformed, not because the houses had changed or the road had altered, but because the bond that carried them had shifted everything it touched. Neighbors lingered, some still wiping tears, others speaking softly as if afraid to disturb the fragile beauty of the moment. They had borne witness to something they would tell for years, a dog who waited without end, and the return that proved his faith was never wasted. For them, the story had already become legend, a parable of loyalty in a world too quick to forget. For the shepherd, it was simpler. He leaned into the man, nose pressed against his coat, drinking in every breath, every heartbeat. His tail swayed, slower now but steady, as though beating a rhythm of belonging. Hunger still gnawed faintly at his ribs, and his body still carried the scars of cold and waiting, but those things had been stripped of their power. What mattered was here, beside him, his world restored. The man's voice shook as he spoke, his words spilling in fragments, apologies tangled with gratitude. I thought I'd lost everything. I didn't know if I'd ever come back. But you." His voice broke, his throat tightening with tears. He pressed his forehead against the shepherd's, closing his eyes. "You saved me. You kept believing when I didn't deserve it." The shepherd responded not with understanding of words, but with the deeper language of presence. Pressing closer, licking the salt of tears, eyes half, closing in contentment. For him, there was no need to untangle the past. There was only this: the reunion, the touch, the certainty that he had not waited in vain. The stranger stood a few steps back, his coat dusted from days crouched on the gravel, his eyes wary but full. He watched as the man and dog clung to one another, a weight lifting from him too. For weeks he had kept vigil with the shepherd, unsure if it would ever lead anywhere, unsure if patience had meaning in the face of silence. Now, watching the gate swing open and love rush through, he felt his chest ease for the first time. The shepherd glanced at him once, a brief look, as if acknowledging the place he had held in the story. Not love, not devotion, but recognition. That was enough. The days that followed were not without their struggles. The shepherd's body needed healing, good meals, warmth, a return to the strength he once had. His ribs filled out, his coat grew glossy again, the dullness fading from his eyes. Yet something in him had changed. He no longer bounded with reckless joy at every sound. His loyalty had aged him, etched depth into his gaze, as though he carried the memory of waiting even in the brightness of reunion. The man too bore scars, not only in his body but in his silence when neighbors asked where he had been, why he had gone. Some stories are too heavy to lay bare, and so he only shook his head, brushing his hand through the shepherd's fur as if to say, the only truth that matters is that I am here now, and so is he. In the evenings, they returned to their old rhythms. The shepherd followed him through the fields again, the tall grass whispering against his flanks, the air alive with scents of earth and sky. Yet even in joy there was a new closeness. He no longer strayed far, no longer raced ahead without looking back. His eyes flicked constantly to his human, as though assuring himself that absence would not strike again. And each time, the man met his gaze, lifting a hand in quiet reassurance. The gate itself became a symbol to the town. People paused when passing, their eyes lingering on it now that it no longer stood closed. They remembered the long weeks when the shepherd sat beside it unmoving, and they marveled at how something so ordinary, rusted metal, peeling paint, had been transformed into a monument of love. Some even placed flowers at its base, tokens of respect for the devotion they had witnessed. The shepherd would pause there too, on occasion, pressing his nose to the iron as though greeting an old companion. It no longer bound him, but it had been the vessel of his faith. Through its bars he had held fast to hope, and through its opening he had been rewarded. In his eyes, it was not a prison but a sacred place, a reminder that waiting had meaning. As winter gave way to spring, the story spread beyond the town. Strangers came to see the gate, to glimpse the dog who had waited. They whispered of his patience, his loyalty, his faithfulness beyond reason. Yet to the shepherd, none of it mattered. Fame was nothing. He did not wait for applause, nor did he live for admiration. His world was small and infinite, at once the sound of boots on gravel, the rough hand against his chest, the voice calling him home. And in that world he was whole. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the man and the shepherd stood together by the gate. The sky was painted in fire, streaks of crimson and gold bleeding into the horizon. The shepherd pressed close, his body warm against the man's leg, his eyes reflecting the glow. The gate hung open beside them, swaying slightly in the breeze, no longer a wall but a passage. The man bent down, resting his forehead once more against the shepherd's. His whisper carried on the wind, soft enough that only the dog could hear. "You never gave up. You brought me back." And as the last light poured through the open gate, the shepherd closed his eyes, his breath slow and steady, his world complete. The waiting was over. The silence was broken. And what remained was not sorrow but light, flooding endlessly through the space where once there had been only rust and emptiness. The gate, at last, no longer closed. The seasons moved forward, as they always do. The frost that once stiffened the shepherd's paws melted into the soft green of spring, and the air filled with scents of life returning. Children played again in the lanes, their laughter mingling with birdsong, and the town breathed easier knowing the waiting had ended. The story of the German shepherd by the gate became something told in passing, a memory wrapped in awe, softened by time. But for those who had stood witness, it was never just a story. It was a reminder of what devotion looks like when stripped bare of words. The shepherd no longer lingered outside that gate. It stood open now, the latch rusted permanently loose, its bars framed by wildflowers that grew at its base. He would sometimes pause there, muzzle brushing the iron as though nodding to an old companion, before trotting after his human. For him, the gate was not a prison, nor even a memory of pain. It was the place where love had proven itself unbreakable. At night, when the world sank into quiet, the shepherd lay curled against his human's feet, the steady rhythm of breathing anchoring him. He did not whimper in his sleep anymore, nor wake trembling at imagined footsteps. The silence that once hollowed him had been filled, and in that fullness he found rest. His dreams carried him not to absence, but to fields where laughter rang out and the air was warm with belonging. The man, too, carried change. He no longer walked with the heavy shoulders of loss. Each time he laid a hand against the shepherd's back, he felt forgiveness stitched into fur, loyalty stronger than his own weakness, and a reminder that some bonds wait even when reason says they should not. He often whispered into the dog's ear, half confession and half promise, "Never again. I won't leave you again." The neighbors still watched them sometimes, though now with quiet smiles. Where once they had seen suffering, they now saw wholeness. Where once there had been silence, they now heard footsteps, man and dog side by side, always together. And so the story closed not in grand gestures, not in thunder or triumph, but in the quiet persistence of love lived daily. The gate, once the symbol of endless waiting, became only a doorway in the background. Open, ordinary, unremarkable. The extraordinary was never in the iron or the rust, but in the heart that refused to move until love returned. In the end, the shepherd did not teach through words, but through presence, that sometimes faith is not blind but fiercely loyal, that love, even when delayed, can still arrive like morning light after the longest night, and that waiting when rooted in devotion is never wasted. And when the sun set over the town, drenching the road in gold, the German shepherd lifted his head, eyes glowing softly in the light. He no longer searched the horizon. He no longer pressed against the gate. He simply leaned into the warmth of the one he had waited for, content at last, his world whole again. The gate, once closed, stood open forever.